1910, America was a nation of 90 million, and for most of us, this is what we meant by horsepower. Life in this time was simpler. There was no television or radio, and coal cost less than $5 a ton. One out of 4 Americans owned a horse, but if you owned a car, you were 1 in 200. William Howard Taft was in the White House. Under President Roosevelt, Taft had served as first governor of the Philippines and as Secretary of War, and he had Roosevelt's strong endorsement when he won the presidency in 1908. But Taft was not the vigorous and crusading politician Roosevelt was, and by 1912, Taft's conservative policies had so angered the former president that Roosevelt decided to challenge Taft for the presidential nomination. Republican Party regulars gave Taft the nomination, but that didn't stop Roosevelt. Endorsed by the Progressive Party, Teddy campaigned for a return to the White House, saying he felt strong as a bull moose. The Democratic nominee was Woodrow Wilson, former president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey. Though Taft and Roosevelt had once been friends, the 1912 campaign was bitter. Roosevelt attacked Taft's conservatism and called for a new nationalism with sweeping progressive reforms, workmen's compensation, minimum wage, and child labor laws. With Republican loyalties divided, Wilson won the election of 1912. Roosevelt carried only 6 states, Taft only 2. Wilson, like Roosevelt, was a progressive politician. He had campaigned for a new freedom, and once in office, he called Congress into special session. New laws brought sweeping changes: banking and currency reform, a federal trade commission, the income tax, and even stronger antitrust laws, all enacted to protect the public interest. The political reforms of Woodrow Wilson's years were among the most significant in history, but there were demands for change by more radical elements, and these would take more time. Poor working conditions and low pay led to many strikes and demonstrations, and sometimes determined protests in the name of social justice did succeed, like the movement for child labor laws. Long hours, dangerous conditions. Who would protect the children in the factories and on the farms from conditions that made them sick and old by their teens? Though President Wilson was a progressive politician, he had first believed that federal regulation of child labor was unconstitutional, but strong sentiment and progressive demand caused him to endorse a child labor law, ensuring its passage by 1916. Uneasy feelings and divided loyalties plagued many European states. Family blood and international treaties were the guidelines, and ancient traditions were often inadequate in dealing with 20th century tensions. Tsar Nicholas and King George were unsympathetic with their cousin Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, and in Austria, Emperor Franz Joseph was old and ailing. The last representatives of the old order were still obsessed with divine rights, pageantry, and patrimony. Kaiser Wilhelm enjoyed shooting. His victims were caged and easy targets. But the world was changing quickly. Emperor Franz Joseph and the Archduke Ferdinand, his nephew and heir to the imperial throne, were acquiring new provinces. One, a small place called Serbia. In 1914, Archduke Ferdinand and his wife went to Serbia on a state visit. In the capital city of Sarajevo, they were assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. It was June 28, 1914, and tensions were strained to the point of breaking. As Austria prepared for the outbreak of war, the ailing emperor collapsed. All the public buildings were draped with crepe, and the empire's flags were flown at half-mast. Troops were preparing to fight a Serbian insurrection in what they believed was the only possible manner: war. Serbian soldiers were jubilant as they marched into battle with Russia as an ally on their border. Austria's ally, Germany, in turn declared war on Russia. Within days, Germany invaded neutral Belgium, sending refugees pouring into France. France did not hesitate as Belgium fell and declared war on Germany. And as the French marched into battle, King George of Great Britain declared war on Germany. Only a month after the deaths of the Archduke of Austria and his wife, Europe was at war. Americans were fighting too, but not in Europe. A border raid by Mexican outlaws on the town of Columbus, New Mexico, brought fighting and death in the streets. Citizens of the town were made refugees by Pancho Villa and his band of outlaws. President Wilson called out 6,000 troops to go to their aid. Wilson appointed General John Pershing to lead the men, and on horseback and in covered wagons, they crossed the Rio Grande, marching into the mountains of Mexico in search of the outlaw and his men. But Villa and his band proved elusive, and after 6 weeks, President Wilson recalled the troops. The war was raging in Europe, and Wilson was concerned with how to keep America neutral, for the allies of France and Great Britain needed help, and America proved willing and able. There were new markets in Europe now. America was a land rich in resources. Raw materials and manufactured goods were sought by the European powers, especially the weapons of war. We even plowed up the Great Plains to provide the Allied nations with goods. By now there were debates about the position of America in the war. Were we, in fact, neutral? Pacifists said we were not. We were supplying the Allied forces with food and arms. In 1916, when the Black Tom munitions factory in New Jersey was sabotaged, some Americans wondered whether it had been the work of Germans or pacifists. The damage was estimated at $22 million. Many were left homeless. They were the first American refugees of the war. Dozens were killed. But it was the submarine warfare which outraged the world. The Germans had designed the submarine with its powerful torpedoes as a weapon to stop the incoming ships which supplied the Allied powers, believing that those who controlled the seas would win the war. And Germany showed no mercy. Ships were torpedoed and sunk, sometimes without warning, and with passengers and crew still aboard. Sometimes there were survivors, sometimes not. Travelers ignored German warnings that passenger ships which entered the war zone would also be attacked. On May 7, 1915, the Lusitania was torpedoed off the Irish coast. It sank in 18 minutes. 726 passengers were saved. Nearly 1,200 lost their lives. The atmosphere was uncertain. Were we neutral? Would we go to war? Pacifist Henry Ford felt we should not. He organized a peace mission to Europe and asked many distinguished Americans to join him. But the public opinion of his efforts was unsympathetic. Some, like Thomas Edison, Luther Burbank, and Helen Keller, declined the invitation, and the mission was a failure. Theodore Roosevelt was in favor of American involvement and spoke to enthusiastic crowds about the defense of freedom. It was 1916, and the election was near. Charles Evans Hughes was the Republican nominee. He was a Supreme Court justice and a supporter of our involvement in the war. Woodrow Wilson was renominated by the Democrats, and though the slogan of the party was, "He kept us out of war," Wilson was concerned that he would be unable to do so. The election was close, but Wilson was re-elected. By Inauguration Day, it seemed unlikely that America could avoid war. Germany's unrestricted warfare had pushed us to the breaking point. Only a month after his inauguration, the president asked Congress for a declaration of war. Even before April 6th, Americans had been in France. Some were Red Cross workers. Others were ambulance drivers for the Allies. Food and munitions from America had been sent, and miles of bandages cut and rolled for shipment to the front. When our own boys went over, the jobs left behind in railway yards and factories, on farms and in the cities, were filled by the wives and daughters, sisters and sweethearts of our soldiers now fighting in France. The women of America went to war, too, and built planes and guns. They filled the shells with powder and stretched linen over the wings of the planes which would carry the Allied forces in the fight for liberty. Of the many women who supported our efforts in the war, few would be remembered as often and with such affection as the Red Cross nurses. They helped in the overwhelming task of healing the wounded. The volunteers in the Red Cross, the YMCA, and the Army Medical Corps helped to keep the soldiers' spirits high. And the Red Cross drives at home encouraged us all to help as well. Perhaps it is surprising that something as simple as a candy bar or a package of cigarettes could mean so much to the fighting men so far from home. But in fact, these tokens meant so much because they were from home. Now, our boys, too, were on the battlefields of France. As they arrived, they still had a sense of the honor and of the glory in saving a people from terror. Our boys were brave, and they approached the front with jubilation. But this feeling could not last, for with the constant roar of the battle came the realization of what this war was really like. Flags were of less comfort than a letter from home, and strident marches fell on unenthusiastic ears. Now it was real. Our boys slogged through the mud and fought side by side with the British and the French. The young Americans must have proved a contrast to the battle-weary Europeans, and their idealism must have seemed peculiar to those who had seen the Battle of the Marne and the carnage at the Somme and at Verdun. Weeks dragged into months, and the prediction that our boys would be home by Christmas proved naive. Christmas came and passed, and another year began in the trenches. It seemed as if there would never be an end to Armageddon. the outbreak of war in Europe, life in America was better in many ways than it had been just a few years before. Lots of us went to the beach. We had learned to swim at the Y, and now wanted to test our skills in the surf. Some workers were beginning to get Saturdays off, and a weekend really gave us time to get away. There was no place quite like Atlantic City. There was the boardwalk, and saltwater taffy and ice cream were fun after a picnic on the beach. A ride in one of the large wicker buggies was always nice if you didn't care for a swim. Snapshots of our trip taken with the new Kodak were fun to show our friends back home. Many Americans had more leisure time than ever before. Baseball was the national pastime. Woodrow Wilson was a fan and threw out the first ball of the season in 1916. Kids across the country followed their favorite teams and practiced in hopes of someday playing for the big leagues, like Cy Young and Babe Ruth. In 1912, Fenway Park opened in Boston, and the next year, Ebbets Field opened in New York. In 1916, when the National Park Service was established, there were already 16 national parks. The automobile made distances seem smaller. The wilderness was no longer a frontier, but a treasure to be protected and enjoyed. If you were lucky enough to have a cabin in the woods, you might enjoy hunting or fishing. Lots of us were glad to get away from the city and relax in the open air. Fishing had its own rewards. Those who didn't have cabins just pitched a tent and started casting. Catching some trout and cooking them over a fire by the edge of a stream made it all worthwhile. In schools all across America, kids were playing football. It was an all-American game. If you liked soccer, you really had to use your head. A few wealthy young men played polo. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was the son of a Presbyterian minister and grew up in an atmosphere of religion and books. He distinguished himself at Princeton and later at Johns Hopkins, where he received his Ph.D. in history. Wilson was a progressive politician, and the reforms of his administration brought new freedom to the nation. He had married Ellen Axon in 1885 and said of her, "My salvation is in being loved." The family was a close one, and Ellen, with her quiet, uneffacing manner, was the strength and support he so much needed. But in August 1914, Ellen Wilson died, never knowing the war had just begun. Wilson would speak of the year that followed as a lifetime of loneliness and heartache. In 1915, friends introduced him to Edith Galt, a lively woman who charmed him. Together they enjoyed golfing and riding, and they fell in love. They were married in December. She would provide him with the support he needed during the war and after. President Wilson said, "She has shown me the full meaning of life." Women's suffrage was an important issue during the decade. Women like Elizabeth Stanton, Jane Addams, and Susan B. Anthony had already spoken out, and now women marched like their British sisters in favor of enfranchisement. After being arrested and released, some women wore their prison uniforms while protesting and carried banners proclaiming, "Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." One strong supporter, pacifist Jeannette Rankin, had been elected to Congress. By 1919, Congress had approved an amendment guaranteeing votes for women. Theodore Roosevelt and his wife, Edith Caro Roosevelt, had been strong supporters of the movement. Though Roosevelt enjoyed spending time at his home in Sagamore Hill, he never retired from public life and remained a vigorous spokesman for the causes in which he believed. When America went to war, Roosevelt petitioned to command a division, but President Wilson told him, "The front lines are no place for a former president." All 4 of his sons served in the war when he could not, but the death of his son Quentin in France was a shock from which he never recovered. The most famous general of the war was John J. Pershing, a graduate of West Point and a veteran of the Indian Wars. In 1917, Wilson appointed him General of the Armies of the United States, commander of the 2 million Americans who fought in France. His distinguished service during the Spanish-American War, the Philippine Insurrection, and in Mexico had proven his ability as a military leader, and his service in the First World War made him one of the greatest heroes of the war. Another great war hero was Eddie Rickenbacker. He was the original air ace and had been a race car driver before the war. One of the most decorated soldiers of the war, he commanded the 94th Aero Pursuit Squadron, which shot 69 German planes from the air. Rickenbacker shot down 26 of them himself. These air aces, led by Captain Eddie, were the finest of their kind, and their courage in the air was unequaled. Black Americans, too, joined the war. Though drafted like whites, they were trained and served in segregated units. Though their training was traditional, many blacks served in non-combatant roles as laborers and kitchen help. But the hundreds who served alongside the French army and distinguished themselves in battle were decorated by the French government.